This online lesson will look at GCSE English Literature Unseen Poetry, and in this lesson it will look at the poems Midwinter and Today, using the practice question comparing both of those poems. In the lesson we will look at reading through the poem Midwinter. There'll be a modelled and guided reading and annotation of that. The main independent outcome will be an exploded quote analysis where you show your understanding of one close detail in this. The reasons behind this are twofold. We're looking in particular for common literary tropes and imagery. That means ideas that are recurrent across pieces of literature, so that applies to both your English language and your English literature. We're also looking at developing and enriching your vocabulary for explaining your ideas. Let's begin by looking at the first question, which is the 24-mark question. So that is where most of your marks are for this section. The amount of time you spend on this should be reflective of that fact. You need to begin by pausing the video here and reading both of the poems. Reading both the poems is really helpful to you because it means that you can see some of the contrasts and similarities, and by putting them together, juxtaposing them, it draws some of those similarities and differences into relief and makes it actually easier to understand both of them. Read both poems, pay particular attention to the titles, consider the 5 W's and the H, who, what, why, where, when and how. Then once you've done that, we can carry on to the next part of it. So at this point you should pause the video and read both poems. Now, presuming that you've done that, it's time for us to look on and begin the reading and annotation of this. We'll look through the first part of this poem and then you will do the second part of it independently. With any poem, it does us well to look at the title to begin with. So the question itself is asking us to look at the season of winter, so clearly that's going to be a focus. Now the poem isn't called Winter though, it is called Midwinter, and instantly that could suggest some things to us. Mid means in the middle of, so it could suggest some ideas about the very middle of winter, a time when winter almost traps the world, the natural world around it. So we could say that has ideas about things being caught right in the depths of winter and trapped. The poem begins. No breezes move the branches, no birds sing. December's frost has turned the world to grey. It gives us a very bleak image of midwinter. It's the dark, bleak midwinter. The question is, how does it do that? That should always be in our minds. Well, one of the first things that occurs to me here is the repetition of no. So I'm going to highlight that. It's the repetition of no. That's immediately defining winter as a time of lack, when things don't happen. So I'm just going to put a quick note there for that word and kind of lack and absence. Now, what else do we have? One of the objectives was talking about common literary tropes. Now, for me, birdsong are a very common trope and idea that turns up very often. Birds are often, but not always, associated with freedom and life, and birdsong is associated with spring and with joy. Clearly here, that isn't the case. So we can make some comments about the lack of birdsong and the fact that that image of freedom, its absence there, is pointing towards the opposite of it. We also have something about colour. December's frost has turned the world to grey. Now, colour choices are often quite interesting to talk about. Grey we tend to associate with dullness, has connotations of being dull, uninteresting, lifeless. So at the beginning there, we have some interesting things being established. We've got ourselves something where we can talk about a conventional literary image being used to convey this sense of absence, of joy. And also we've got the repetition of no, and of course the colour imagery there. As we carry on, we'll have a look at what else we find. The earth in winter trusting for the spring, the silver hedges where the dead leaves cling, the clouds that shroud the winter sun away. Again, there are some interesting things that jump out or might jump out to you there. For me, it's the language of death. We have the word dead, but also we have the word shroud. Now, shroud is a covering, but often it's associated with a covering of the dead. So we have here the language of death and of decay and entropy. One of the objectives was to talk about vocabulary and thinking about that. And this is where, when we're doing this kind of practice, you've got an opportunity to think about enriching your vocabulary and choosing words that are less obvious. So we have the language of death and entropy. Now, your job at this point is to continue the reading. The next task is to continue reading the poem. Your job is to pick out at least a couple more details and think about trying to find links with some of those points we've just made there. These ideas of absence, entropy, death, lack. This idea that winter is being presented in quite a negative way. So at this point you should pause the video, spend a few minutes doing that and add a couple more details to what you've got. Hopefully by this point you have found a couple more details, and this is where we're going to move on to task 2. Task 2 is to take one of those details and to explode it in your book. To explode it means we try to really mine down into the detail, thinking about those things, about the impression that you get, the inferences you make, and how the writer has done this. So let's have a look at what we can do there in a model and an example. Now I've chosen the quote, "No birds sing." I like that because in the first instance we have the word no. We've talked already about the fact that there is repetition there. So it's a sense of absence. And then of course we have the bird song, which is associated traditionally with freedom and positive things and life. Here, clearly not. So in exploding the quote, I'm thinking about AO1 and AO2. AO1 is your impression. So when I see that word there, no, I think it's about a time of absence. It's presented in a negative manner. And bird song almost defines a lack of freedom. AO2 is when we talk about how, and that's where we're going to zoom in on the language. So sometimes we zoom in and we talk about why that word has been chosen. I want to talk here about the technique, which is repetition. Repetition here is for emphasis. And I also want to mention the fact that it continues through the text. In my annotations, I'm also going to note here something about birds singing and the use of imagery. So that's an AO2 technique. And I could talk about the fact that conventionally birds are associated with freedom and song is associated with joy, but in this case, they're very much not. So now it's your turn to go about exploding a quote. We'd like you to explode a quote of detail which hasn't been shown to you in the modelled answer, so that you can show some of your thoughts and some of your ideas about this. So it's very much about quality over quantity, but please make sure that we're getting that balance between AO1, which is saying what's the impression, and AO2, how the poet has done that. You know, whether we're zooming in on language, whether we're finding a technique to talk about, we're talking about the methods, the techniques, how that meaning is got across, not just what it means. This is the point where you should pause, and you should probably spend in the region of 10 minutes on that. Okay, to recap, by the end of this session, you should have some annotations on your copy of Midwinter, additional to those that have been given in the model, and you should have that quote analysis on your page, an exploded quote where you're drilling down to the detail of AO1 and AO2.